Thanks, Paul. Everyone hear that? That's all right, isn't it? Sounds pretty good. So, welcome to session 3, the origin and history of the Bible. We've already had introduction to it, and last week Mike went through a bit of the stuff when you're starting to read it. In fact, here's some of the things that Mike went through last week with those of you who are here, having some sort of organised way to read through it, preparing yourself to read it, and then being able to deal with the strange language and different customs. And he looked at the footnotes and the cross references and the value of them for helping people join the golden thread throughout the Bible. And he did give homework, but he wanted everyone to ring him to report about how they'd gone with the homework. So can do that after. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is inspiration. So there's 66 books in the Bible. How do we know that they're inspired books? What about, there's other books out there, religious books. Why aren't they in the Bible? So we'll have a bit of a look at that. We'll also have a bit of a look at some manuscripts that provide evidence that the Bibles actually have been reliably copied and that they're accurate down through the ages. We'll look a little bit at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we'll have a bit of a look at how we got the Bible in English, and have a bit of a look at some of the things to think about when you're choosing a Bible. So the word inspiration literally means God breathed. So the Bible's saying it's inspired because God actually told people or breathed the words to people what they should be writing. And that verse, I think Graham rolled that one out in week 1, that it says all scripture is given by inspiration of God, and you can see the rest of it there. And this talks about the holy men and women of God in the old days who spoke after they were moved by the Holy Spirit, so that God actually told them what to write. It's a little bit tricky when you're dealing with people who are deciding whether or not to actually believe in the Bible. It can be a little bit tricky just to use the Bible itself to prove itself. So there are the other things we will look at, the manuscripts and the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're other evidence that points and helps us to understand and believe that the Bible did come from God. Now, sometimes these things were like word for word. So people wrote down exactly what God told them to write. Other times, it maybe wasn't word for word, but God told the people what the idea was, and they had a bit more freedom to sort of put it in their own way. In the book, it gives you an example of the Apostle Paul, who has a fairly specific style of writing that is quite easily recognisable as him, excuse me, but he gets the message across that God gave. Now, the next little bit, and you'll have to excuse me, is about the Canon of Scripture. And that basically just means the books or the writings that have been considered to be inspired and that are actually included in the Bible itself. It's called the canon. And the question is, I guess, sorry again, excuse me, going to have to put one of these in, sorry Sandy. My dad used to do it. So the thing is, who decided which ones were inspired and which ones weren't, and how? So that's a bit of a big one. Because, look, in some of the books they actually say the word of the Lord is, or this is what the Lord says. So it's pretty obvious, those ones, they're sort of being told. But other books, not so obvious. Now, there was tests back in the day to see whether a prophet was for real or not, because people pretended to be prophets. One of them was that they should predict the future accurately, so they had to make prophecies that actually were proven to be true, and that's probably not the easiest thing to do. And the other one was that they weren't to be teaching things that made the people turn away from God. So two pretty major tests that were applied. By the time of Jesus, the Old Testament was quite well established, and those books that were in the Old Testament, they were accepted because they were written by people who were proven to be prophets and were accepted as prophets, people like Moses, Isaiah and so on, who'd made prophecies that had actually come true. So they were accepted as prophets, and the books were included without any problem. Now, the next little bit is the Apocrypha. Now, most Bibles, as Graham showed and I said, contain 66 books. But there are some Bibles that have more. Some Catholic Bibles and some other certain Orthodox Christian Bibles include extra books. And some actually have up to 17 extra books in them. Not all that common, but they do. And these other books are known as the Apocrypha. And that word means like hidden books. Now, in general, these books aren't accepted as having been inspired. So they're not generally included in your average Bible that you would buy from a bookstore. Now, you can see some of the books there. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some are historical and quite factual. And the example in the notes for that is the Maccabees books. Now, a lot of these books occurred during the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's around about that time, about 200 BC to 100-ish AD, sort of roughly. Now, some of them were reasonably historical and factual, like the Maccabees ones I said. They've got some really good information about what happened to Jerusalem in Israel in the time leading up to when Christ came. And they seem to be quite reasonable. Now, this one called Tobit, this book in there that's called Tobit, he apparently was a guy who travelled around with some sort of angel and fought demons with the organs of a fish. So fairly out there, some of these things. Don't make a lot of sense, don't really match with the rest of the Bible, hence not included. Some of them also have quite a lot of errors in them in terms of like historical stuff. One of the books, I think it might be Judith, is it saying here? Talks about Nebuchadnezzar as the king of Assyria rather than the king of Babylon. So quite incorrect in the facts, and that are totally all over the shop. There's another one that's claimed to be written at a different time by a friend of Jeremiah. However, it was written several hundred years later, so they don't make a lot of sense, some of them. And so it's quite clear that quite a few shouldn't be included because they're just completely wrong, and if people read them, They would just make the Bible into a bit of a joke, really. Now, it's accepted by mainstream Christianity that none of these books came from prophets. And they weren't accepted by the Jews back in the day because they didn't pass that two-prophet test. So they didn't see them as inspired, and that's why they didn't come down through the ages as part of the actual Bible itself. They quoted them sometimes, but not really, in a factual way. Here's a quote from Unger's Bible Dictionary as to, why these books aren't part of Scripture. First one, inaccuracies and anachronism. Anachronisms is when they claim to be written in a different time. So they say they were written back at the time and they actually weren't. So they make false claims about themselves. They teach false doctrines. They don't fit in the style and the content of the rest of the Bible, and they're not prophetic. So they fail quite miserably on pretty much all levels. They also weren't popular with the scholars of the day, and this is just to show that the various philosophers and historians and people, they quoted a lot from the actual Bible, but not from those books. So that just lends a bit more weight as to why, they weren't considered to be gospel in inverted commas. Right. So, Old Testament manuscripts. Just got to see what there is next. Okay. The Old Testament was mainly written in Hebrew, and it was between roughly 1450 BC and 400 BC, so about 1,000 years there. It was copied by scribes over and over and over because there was no computers, there was no presses to print things, it had to be hand copied. And so we ask, well, how do we know that they didn't just change it as they went? It's been copied hundreds or thousands of times over hundreds or thousands of years. How do we know what we've got is the same as what started? It's like Chinese whispers around a room. It doesn't take long before it all gets changed, right? Well, it was the specific job of people called scribes to do that. And they had a lot of rules and they took extraordinary amount of care in what they were doing. And several copies of the Old Testament have been found dating about 900 AD. And these were from a group known as the Masoretes, and they had very precise rules that they used for copying this stuff. The whole scroll had to be carefully ruled up before they started writing, had to use specific materials, specific number of letters for each line, even number of lines to each column, and that had to match up across the whole scroll. They weren't to use memory, had to study it and speak it before they wrote it, and then it was checked, counting the words, counting the letters, and then at the end of all that, it had to be checked by the supervisor. So you can sort of see a painstaking process, but a very careful one. That is an example of one of the scrolls. That's from the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, I don't think that our printer at home could print something out that neat, to be honest. And that's handwritten. It's pretty amazing. Does it look any good up there? Oh, yeah. Pretty amazing, isn't it? The width, the letters, the columns, pretty impressive. There are some spots where there are little errors, because I guess if you've got human beings doing things, they can still make mistakes. It's just, but nothing major. So let's keep going. Here's a bit more about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, they were a large collection of scrolls that were discovered in about 1947. Now, in the book it says they were discovered by 3 Bedouin shepherds, but I heard there was a little bald kid throwing rocks into the caves, and he chucked a rock in and he heard something smash. And it was one of these big jars. And instead of just running off and hiding and saying, whatever, he thought, there must be something good in there. And so he told his dad, who might have been one of the shepherds, and they went in and they found all these clay jars in a whole lot of the caves all around that area. So what they did, they found that there was about 800 different manuscripts when they got them out, dated between about that time period, 150 BC and 250 AD. Every book from the Old Testament except for Esther was found amongst them, which is pretty amazing. And the best part, that other text, because up until then they were dated on those Masoretic ones that were copied and just hoping that they were much the same. Well, they were about 1,000 years old, the Masoretic one that was being used. Well, Dead Sea Scrolls were about 2,000 years old and almost exactly the same. So it just showed that what had been copied down through that period of time was pretty much exactly the same as it was in the day when it was put on those scrolls, which is a pretty awesome proof of the accuracy of the Bible. When they discovered Isaiah, some of the translations of the Bible had already started to be written, and they had to actually change some of it because there was some slight differences and extra things that they found. So again, that contributes to the accuracy of our Bibles that we have today. What else is there in here there's a bit more stuff about this in the notes. The other part that's good about the scrolls is that they help to put dates on prophecies that had happened. So there were people before the scrolls were found who were saying that, like Isaiah and in the Psalms, prophecies about Jesus, they were saying that they wrote them after Jesus had already been there, so they were just fake, basically. That was from that Masoretic stuff. But when they found these, they were clearly dated from before Jesus' time. So they showed that they were actual real prophecies that had been proven to be correct. And for people like us who believe in the Bible, and for people who are looking to see whether the Bible might be true, when you can see that something has accurately predicted the future, that's fairly compelling evidence. Oh, there you go. Proof that the prophecies were already fulfilled. I'm ahead of my time. And this is just a picture of a dude studying a scroll. You can see it's pretty long. Don't really know what the scroll is. There's some other bits, and you can still see on them, they're very accurate and very equal, symmetrical. Even though they're a little bit wrecked, they're still looking pretty good. And that's just another example. Now, the New Testament manuscripts, New Testament was written in Greek. And there's a lot of manuscripts around that were found of the New Testament, much more than the Old Testament. And they all have shown that they accurately match up with what we have in the New Testament. Now, there is also a New Testament Apocrypha with books that claim, to be inspired or whatever. However, none of these ones really got any credence from anybody. They're not included in any Bibles. No one believes that they're inspired, but they're interesting other religious books. This guy, Professor Bruce, he's saying that there's so much evidence for the New Testament that if they weren't religious-based, no one would question them. They get questioned because they're religious in nature, but the classical authors, who no one bothers to question, there's way more evidence for the New Testament writings. So mainly because religion is always quite controversial, people like to question it more. And this other guy, he's just talking about there's a lot of quoting from the New Testament by all sorts of writers. And he's saying that there's so much that even if the actual New Testament got destroyed, you could take all the quotes from all these other authors and you could probably put the whole New Testament back together. You might not be able to, but he's saying that it's been quoted a lot. This is just a what do you call that? A table of how many copies of different writings, and again you can see some of the famous philosophers and authors and things like Plato and Euripides, Aristotle, and Aristotle, he had 49 copies. Well, the New Testament has 24,000 copies made of the manuscripts. So, probably 10 times more than all of them put together. No one really questions, the logic of Aristotle or, Plato, the geniuses or whatever, but, yeah. Now, because you're all starting to go to sleep, we've got time to get up and have a little cup of coffee if you want, toilet break, stretch your legs. Just come back in, 5 to 10 minutes or something, that'll be good. Okay. So, sort of change gears slightly and have a bit of a look at how the Bibles first got into English. There's some real old ones that go way, way back, but they're not really intelligible by us now because the words are so different. So sort of not worry too much about them. This is just a chart form, I guess, if you can read it from there. Oh yeah, you can see it pretty good there. So it starts off with the original manuscripts, ancient copies, ancient versions, Vulgate, Masoretic. Then we get to that Wycliffe. So that was the first translation of a whole Bible into English. It was about 1380. He didn't go from Hebrew and Greek, but he translated from Latin. It wasn't popular with the church of the day because when people got their hands on it, they sort of realised that what was happening wasn't really in line with Bible teaching necessarily. So it caused a few issues, and Wycliffe got killed, and a lot of his followers got opposition. I'm not sure whether he got killed, but anyway, after he was dead, they decided to dig up his bones, burn them, and then chuck him in the river as a bit of an example to stop people wanting to translate the Bible. So it was a pretty nasty sort of time. His Bible was handwritten in a manuscript. It took 10 months or so for each copy and was very costly, about as much as an educated person's wage for a year. So most people then obviously couldn't afford a Bible, but they could actually, probably not everyone could even read back then either, but they were able to hear it being read, sort of more common people, which is pretty good. Now, in the 1450s, printing presses came along, and so the availability of the Bible kind of exploded because it could just be mass printed. I mean, still slower than what we've got now, but much faster than handwritten over 10 months. So that sort of spread it even further. Then there was Tyndale. So where are these on here? So you can see. Do that on me? Yeah. So there's Wycliffe, and then the next one up, Tyndale there. He came from Oxford. I think he was a scholar at Oxford. And he studied he studied the scriptures in both Greek and Hebrew, Tyndale. But he was forced to relocate to Germany because of persecution and opposition. He did the New Testament, and then he got killed, got imprisoned first, but then he was actually strangled first, then he was burnt at the stake. Another example, I guess, to put people off, fairly extreme. And the next one after that, this Coverdale guy, which is, where's that? Just another one up above there. Here is one of Tyndale's assistants who was helping him. So he carried on after Tyndale was put in prison and then killed. And interestingly enough, Henry VIII was in favour, started to become in favour because they'd broken ties with the Roman Catholic Church and started to form Church of England and so on. But then unfortunately, so Coverdale started doing a Bible which was sort of endorsed by the king, but then Mary came on the scene after King Henry died, Mary Queen of Scots or whatever, is that her? And she was back with the Roman Catholic Church, so then the printing of the Bible and that became, again, a no-go, and he had to flee to Geneva because he was going to get killed. And so it became the Geneva Bible, which is the next one, that he actually finished the rest of it from Geneva, if that makes sense. It's sort of a bit of a up and down sort of thing. And then because this Geneva Bible was really popular and it was acknowledged as the best thing around that time that was available for people to read and so on, King James decided to have a conference, and then he decided that a translation should be made of the whole Bible as close to the original as possible, and it was only to be used in all churches of England at that time while they were having their services. So that's the first one. King James Version, called authorised because it was authorised by the king. It sort of was the most widely accepted worldwide English translation of the Bible for, several hundred years, really, after that time. Widely available for people to read and not getting killed doing it, which is a really good bonus for them. Here's just a picture of a picture of a Bible in the 1500s. That's a front page of a King James. It's pretty fancy looking. King James has had to have some amendments to it, certainly not perfect. amended. It's been amended a few times. The first ones, they were written well before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So that, meant some things had to be revised here and there. But overall, a pretty accurate representation of those ancient scrolls and manuscripts. Some famous mistakes. There have been some mistakes. I'll just look, you can read the others. The last one I find pretty funny. Printers have persecuted me without cause. Those pesky printers, never liked them. So it should have been princes persecuted me without cause. So yeah, there's been a few mistakes over the years, but that's human nature whenever people do things. You can all read that. There's a whole lot of new modern translations. There's more than 70 versions. There's probably more than 70 different versions now. Lots of different ones. The newer versions, have the advantage of being based on all the available manuscripts, and there's more knowledge easily gained these days, which is kind of good. So that sort of brings us up to the point of choosing a Bible. Once upon a time there was no choice in choosing a Bible. You could have a King James Version or a King James Version, and you could have a black one or a black one. That was it. But now if you are to go into a Bible shop, religious store like Koorong or whatever, there's two whole aisles with all different sorts, shapes, sizes, colours, versions, and that can be a little bit confusing and probably need to be a little bit careful. Some of the ones today are designed for really easy reading, which is good in one way because they can be understood. However, sometimes they don't stick necessarily to the accuracy of the original text, which is not a good thing if you're trying to study the Bible and what things mean. So just have to balance these things up. Here's some things to think about when choosing a Bible. What's good for one person isn't necessarily going to be good for another. A study Bible might not be that easy to read, and an easy to read Bible might not be that good for study, because the accuracy versus the ease of reading, you have to balance those out. Reading with kids is going to be different from reading with adults or by yourself. Having several versions is pretty helpful because you can compare things. Okay. One thing I wasn't too sure last week whether I might have missed before I tuned in with Mike. Did he talk about concordances and things like that at all, or not? No. Okay, so that doesn't really get a mention. So a concordance is just a book that tells you the meanings of the original words. So having that on hand is also pretty useful, because you could use several versions, but you may not get to the bottom of what the original words meant to mean. So you can look at a concordance, find out the meaning of the word, and then you can compare that with your versions to see which one's closer or which one's not. That's pretty handy. Okay, so then there's different approaches to translations. Some try to go word for word from the original. It's called formal equivalence. And the New American Standard Bible has a fair crack at doing that. The King James Bible has a bit of a crack at doing that too. Not quite as accurate as the New American Standard. Then there's thought for thought. So that's dynamic equivalence, that's called. That's where the author tries to get across the same idea or exactly the same idea, but can be using different words. And then, hey, it's going backwards. Then there's paraphrasing, which involves some interpretation. So the New International Version is a thought-for-thought thing. So it puts across the idea of the original but changes the words around. The Living Bible can just kind of make stuff up. And not all of it, but some of it. It's not all that accurate. And it says in the notes about you'll come across things which aren't really clear. And it's an enormous help to have several versions, while it's also an enormous help to have the concordance that I talked about, maybe Bible dictionary, other things like that too, to help you, understand things on a bit of a wider scale, I guess, than just a Bible by itself might be a bit limited. Now, most versions are somewhere on that continuum between the formal equivalents to the paraphrasing thing, and some do a bit of both, some don't. You have to pick what works for you, also what's accurate too. Now there's a bit of an exercise on here that we won't do, it's on page 32. And what it does is it asks people to read from Matthew chapter 5, the verses that are known as the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, blessed are those ones, to read them and then to make up a paraphrase of your own and see how it kind of compares. And it's just about to think about what did you leave out, what did you include, why, and then just to consider how, people who have interpreted the Bible, how and why they might have done the same thing. Now there's an example here about paraphrasing. Like we said, it has the same ideas, but it doesn't necessarily follow the original text. So most people here would know what Psalm 23 says. I should probably know that. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for thou art with me, etc., etc. That's not bad. So, in the Living Bible, it says, because the Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. He lets me rest in the meadow grass, leads me beside the quiet stream. He restores my failing health. He helps me to do what honours him the most. So it's kind of the same, but it's not exactly the same. It's easy to read and it can give a bit of fresh light on things, maybe make you think about things you hadn't thought about before, but might not necessarily be accurate. That's the concern. And you want to have accuracy. If you're trying to study the Bible, you need to, at the end of the day, understand what it's actually trying to say, not just what someone else reckons it's trying to say. And that's why they're not so good for study purpose. So there's a couple of examples in the book on page 33 of the real literal word-for-word translation, and how in some other languages, some of the ways that they have put the grammar changes the meaning for different languages in different countries, and where that could be a little bit of a trap for them. The example is beat his breast in remorse, and in Zambia that doesn't mean the same thing. It's a different meaning. So it's just those subtle things that you need to be aware of. That probably didn't make much sense. Read it in the book; it'd probably make more sense than me. Now, other things with versions, they vary in the vocabulary they use, the tone that they take. the language, and the doctrinal orientation, because there are some Bibles that were written, printed for specific churches or denominations, and they might have particular bias towards certain beliefs that their denomination has. So we just need to be aware of that if we're using a particular Bible, whether it leans one way or not another, and that's where checking the meanings of original words with a concordance can really be helpful, and comparing different versions too. That's always really good. It is useful. Then there's textual layout. And that's just about how it's set out, basically. And this is saying what's a good layout is that one that prints the text in natural paragraphs, includes subheadings to help the reader see natural breaks in the text. And sometimes the subject stuff sort of takes a bit of a change. And if there's a subheading in there, that can be helpful because you go, oh, that was from, oh, now it's talking about this. And that might be really helpful if you're trying to figure out what's going on. Good textual layout would print the poetic parts in the natural verses of the actual poem that it is, rather than just force it into the little verse breakups that we see in Bibles. Put list of names or places in columns so you can see that that's a list, rather than, again, forcing it into the main text, which, look, it's just what people might prefer. And the note saying the New International Version is one that really varies its text layout to help the readers. King James just pretty much forces everything into that chapter and verse layout, regardless of what it is. And again, it's really about what any person might prefer. Some people may not even care about that, others it might be really hard for them. So it depends on how you learn things and what you like, really. Other things to consider: wide margins around the text. That would be so you could write notes or things. You know, some Bibles have got good gaps for notes and stuff, some have none. You have to decide whether you're a note writer or not. Cross-references, I think Brother Mike showed last week, they're pretty useful, because if you're trying to trace something through and you don't have those cross-references, you can't do that. Makes it a lot harder. So that cross-referencing is pretty important, and not all Bibles have it. Charts and maps, most of them have them at the back, because then if you're reading something, you can look and see where it is. I mean, these days you can probably just Google it anyway, but if you've got a hard Bible, then you would want to be able to have a look and see where things are. Journaling, that's space in there to write stuff down or draw pictures as you go, and I looked that up. It said it might be so you can express your feelings as you're reading. So, yeah, Rob might start doing that now. But, yeah, that's journaling. Then they have journaling Bibles. I didn't even know that they had that, where there's extra pages and things so that you can actually write what you feel as you read something, or what it means, or draw a picture, which for some people is probably good, I guess. The material and the quality. So if you buy something that's really cheap, it's probably not going to last very long. Like, you can get really thin paper on the pages and that, you know, if you're wanting to use it and study it, it might fall apart. So you want to get something that's decent. And I added this one in, electronic, as an option. So I have one of these now, and in here I have the concordance, about 4 Bible dictionaries, about 20 versions of the Bible with cross-references. You can put notes in, you can highlight things. So just as an option for people to consider. Some people don't like it, some people do, but it is worthwhile. You know, there's maps, there's all sorts of things. So that's another option that people can think about. All right. So, these are the things that we've gone through. Next week, we're going to talk about reasons to believe, and Graham's going to look at the resurrection of Jesus, some of the Bible prophets, prophecies about the destruction of Babylon in particular, and also the survival of the Jews down through the ages. So whatever you do, don't miss that one. Oh, it's not next week, is it? It's in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Don't miss out on that. Oh, homework. Well, Mike wants to know about this. If you do this homework, it's about reading different translations. It's on page 34. So you do that and have a chat with Mike about it. Thanks everyone for being here.